hand closed around Grace Whitfield's ankle in the dark, and her scream caught in her throat before it could even leave her body. She kicked out hard, her heart slamming against her ribs, her eyes snapping open to see a tall figure crouched over her in the moonlight. For one terrible second, she thought this was how it would end, alone in a garden nobody owned anymore, forgotten by a world that had already forgotten her. "Get up," the man said. His voice was low and even, but there was something underneath it that made her stop struggling. Not kindness, not cruelty either, just absolute control. Grace scrambled back against the stone bench she had been sleeping on, pulling her thin coat tight around her body. The garden around them was wild and overgrown, roses climbing untamed over broken trellises, weeds swallowing the paths that must have once been beautiful. She had found this place 3 weeks ago, slipping through a gap in the iron fence when she had nowhere else to go. Nobody came here. That was the point. Except now somebody had. "I didn't do anything," she said, her voice shaking despite her effort to sound steady. "I'll leave. Just let me leave." The man straightened, and moonlight fell fully across his face for the first time. He was younger than she expected, maybe in his early 30s, with sharp features and dark eyes that studied her the way a man studies a problem he did not expect to find on his own property. He wore a black coat that probably cost more than everything Grace owned combined, and even standing still, he carried himself like someone used to rooms going quiet when he entered them. "This is my land," he said. "Nobody comes here." "I noticed the gate was broken," Grace said. She hated how small her voice sounded. She had once been a woman who spoke her mind without flinching, who ran a small bakery on a corner that everyone in her neighborhood knew, who laughed loudly and lived without apology. That woman felt very far away now. "I'm sorry, I'll go." She tried to stand, and her legs, stiff from sleeping on stone for 3 weeks, betrayed her. She stumbled, and before she could catch herself, the man's hand shot out and caught her arm. His grip was firm but not rough, steadying her rather than restraining her. "Sit down," he said. It was not a request. Grace sat, mostly because her body no longer had the strength to argue. She studied him back now, trying to read what kind of danger he represented. Men who dressed like him, who moved through darkness without a flicker of fear, were not accountants or teachers. She had seen enough of the world in the last year to recognize power when it stood in front of her, and this man wore power the way other people wore coats. "Who are you?" he asked. "Nobody," she said. "Nobody you need to worry about." "That is not what I asked." She lifted her chin, some old stubbornness flickering back to life despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her. "Grace. My name is Grace Whitfield. And before you ask, no, I am not a thief, and no, I did not come here to cause trouble for anyone. I found a gap in a fence around a place nobody was using, and I needed somewhere to sleep that wasn't a doorway or a bench in the cold. That's the whole story." The man was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she refused to give him the satisfaction. His eyes moved over her, not with the leering assessment she had grown used to fearing from strangers, but with something closer to calculation, as if he were trying to solve her. "Dante," he said finally, "Dante Morty." The name meant nothing to Grace, and she said so, which seemed to surprise him. A flicker of something crossed his face, gone before she could name it. "You don't know who I am," he said. "Should I?" "Most people do." "I've been a little busy," Grace said, gesturing vaguely at the garden, at her worn coat, at the general disaster her life had become, surviving. "I haven't kept up with local celebrities." For a moment, she thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, though it vanished so fast she could not be certain it had been there at all. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 3 weeks, maybe closer to 4 now, I've lost track." "And before that?" Grace hesitated. This was the part she did not like to talk about, the part that still felt like a wound too fresh to touch. but something about the direct way he asked, without pity in his voice, made it easier to answer than she expected. "I had a bakery," she said. "A small one 2 streets from where I grew up. My mother left it to me when she passed. I ran it for 6 years. Business was good or good enough. Then a man convinced me to take a loan to expand, promised it would double what I made in a year. He was not who he said he was. The loan came with terms I did not understand until it was too late, and when I could not pay what he claimed I owed, he took the bakery, my apartment above it, everything. I did not have family left to go to. I did not have savings, because everything I had went into keeping the shop alive those last months, trying to save something that could not be saved." She stopped, surprised at herself for saying so much to a stranger who had woken her by grabbing her ankle in the dark. But there was something about him, some quality of complete attention, that made the words come easier than they had in a long time. Nobody had asked her story in months. Most people crossed the street when they saw her sitting on a bench with everything she owned in a single bag. "What was the man's name?" Dante asked. His voice had changed slightly, sharpened at the edges. "Why does that matter to you?" "Because men who prey on people like that usually have a pattern. And patterns are useful to know." Grace studied him, trying to understand what kind of person found information about predatory lenders useful rather than simply sad. "Edmund Price," she said finally. "Does the name mean anything to you?" Something shifted behind Dante's eyes, brief and controlled, but Grace caught it anyway. "It might," he said, which told her nothing and everything at once. He was quiet again, looking around the garden as though seeing it for the first time in years, taking in the state of it, the neglect, the wild beauty struggling up through years of abandonment. Grace watched him and wondered what he was thinking, wondered why a man who clearly had the authority to have her removed from his property in an instant was instead standing here asking her questions in the moonlight. "This was my grandmother's garden," he said eventually, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, a softness that did not match the hard lines of his face or the danger she still sensed rolling off him like heat from a stove. "She died 6 years ago. The house has been empty since. I have not had reason to come back until tonight." "I'm sorry," Grace said, and meant it, even though she had no idea who this grandmother had been. "Do not be, it was a long time ago." He looked at her again, that assessing look returning. "You have nowhere to go." It was not a question, so Grace did not answer it as one. She simply held his gaze, refusing to let the shame she felt curl her shoulders forward. "I have nowhere to go tonight," she corrected. "Tomorrow I will figure something out. I always do." "How long has tomorrow been the plan?" The question landed harder than she expected, because the honest answer was that tomorrow had been the plan for weeks now, and each day the plan failed a little more completely than the day before. She did not answer, and her silence answered for her. Dante crouched again, this time not close enough to threaten her, but close enough that she could see the calculation continuing behind his eyes, some internal debate she was not privy to. She braced herself for him to tell her to leave, to threaten her with the police, to do any of the things she had steeled herself against during 3 weeks of sleeping somewhere she did not belong. Instead, he said something that made no sense at all. "There is a house behind these gardens. It has been closed for years, but it is not falling apart. There are rooms with beds, a kitchen that still works, hot water if the pipes have not frozen. You could stay there." Grace blinked, certain she had misheard him. "I'm sorry." "I am offering you a room," Dante said, as though the words were simple, as though he had not just appended everything she understood about how strangers, particularly dangerous ones, treated women sleeping in gardens that did not belong to them. "Why?" The question came out sharper than she intended, suspicion bleeding into her voice. She had learned the hard way that when something appeared to be given freely, there was usually a price attached that only became visible later, when it was too late to refuse it. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," he said. Nobody offers a stranger a room in their house for nothing. I am not most people, Dante said, and something in the flatness of his voice told her this was simply a fact, not an attempt to sound impressive. Grace studied him for a long moment, weighing every instinct she had left against the impossible cold of another night on stone, against the ache in her body that had not fully left in 3 weeks, against the fear that had become such a constant companion that she sometimes forgot what it felt like to move through the world without it. I don't know you, she said finally. I don't know what you do, or why a man like you, who clearly does not need to explain himself to anyone, is standing in an abandoned garden at night offering a room to a homeless woman he found sleeping on a bench. That is fair, Dante said. You do not know me. And I will not pretend I can explain myself to your satisfaction tonight. He paused, and something in his expression shifted, becoming, for just a moment, less like a man used to command and more like someone genuinely uncertain of his own choice. But I would rather know you are somewhere warm than picture you here, in the cold, when I drive away. The honesty of it disarmed her more than any argument could have. Grace searched his face for the lie she expected to find there, and did not find it, or at least did not find one she could identify. She thought of the freezing nights ahead, of the way her cough had started to linger longer than it should, of how close she had come, twice now, to simply giving up and walking into traffic rather than face another day of this particular kind of invisible suffering. One night, she said finally, hating how much relief flooded through her at her own words. I'll stay one night, and if anything feels wrong, I am leaving and you will not stop me. I would not stop you, Dante said. You have my word. She almost laughed at that, the strangeness of trusting the word of a man whose full name she barely knew, in a life where trust had cost her everything she once had. But something about the steadiness in his eyes made her believe him anyway, or at least made her willing to gamble one more night on the possibility that he meant it. He extended a hand to help her stand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her legs were unsteady beneath her, weeks of poor sleep and worse meals catching up all at once, and for a moment she swayed. Dante's hand tightened around hers, not pulling her closer, simply keeping her upright, patient in a way she had not expected from a man who radiated so much barely contained intensity. This way, he said, releasing her hand once she had steadied herself, and turning toward a path she had not noticed before, half hidden behind a wall of climbing roses. Grace followed him through the tangled garden, past broken statues and dry fountains, until the shape of a large house rose out of the darkness ahead of them, its windows dark, its stone walls softened by years of ivy. It looked like something from an old photograph, grand and half forgotten, waiting for someone to remember it existed. Dante unlocked a side door and led her into a wide hallway that smelled of dust and old wood, flicking on lights as he went, revealing furniture draped in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. Grace wrapped her arms around herself, unsure if the chill she felt now was from the cold or something closer to disbelief. There is a room at the top of the stairs, Dante said. It should still have linens. I will have someone bring food in the morning. You're not staying here, Grace asked, and immediately wished she had not, unsure what answer she wanted more, that he would or that he would not. No, Dante said. I have business elsewhere tonight, but you will not be alone in the house. There is a woman, Margaret, who looks after the property. She will be here by morning. Grace nodded, though 100 questions crowded her throat, none of which she felt brave enough to ask yet. Why was he doing this? What business could a man like him possibly have at this hour? What exactly had she just agreed to, stepping through this door into a life that had, until an hour ago, existed entirely outside anything she could have imagined for herself? At the base of the stairs, Dante paused and looked back at her, and for the first time since he had woken her in the garden, something almost uncertain crossed his features. You said you would leave if anything felt wrong, he said. I am holding you to that, but I hope you will give it more than one night before you decide." Before Grace could respond, he was already moving toward the door, his coat sweeping behind him like a shadow detaching itself from the darkness of the hallway. The door closed with a soft click, and then she was alone in the enormous, silent house, standing at the bottom of a staircase that led to a room she had never seen, offered to her by a man whose name she now knew but whose reasons she did not understand at all. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath her weight, and found the room exactly where he said it would be. It was simple but clean, a large bed with white linens catching the moonlight through tall windows, a fireplace cold but ready to be lit, a wardrobe standing empty against one wall. It was more comfort than she had touched in months, and she stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, afraid that if she moved, the entire scene would dissolve like something out of a dream too good to survive contact with reality. Finally, she stepped inside and closed the door behind her, turning the small lock out of habit rather than any real belief it would stop a man like Dante Morty if he wished to enter. She sat on the edge of the bed, running her hand over linen softer than anything she had touched in a year, and felt tears rise in her throat that she refused to let fall. She did not know who Dante Morty was, or what world she had just stepped into by accepting his offer. She did not know why a man who moved through darkness like he owned it had chosen, on a random night, to notice her, to speak to her, to offer her shelter instead of simply having her removed. But as exhaustion finally pulled her down into the first real sleep she had known in weeks, one thought followed her into the dark. Whatever this was, it was already too late to walk away from it entirely. Somewhere beyond the tall windows an engine started, tires crunched over gravel, and the sound of Dante Morty's car faded into the night, leaving Grace Whitfield alone in a house full of secrets she had not yet begun to uncover, in a life that had, in a single strange hour, tilted completely off its axis. She would learn soon enough that Dante Morty's world did not offer shelter without consequence. But that night, wrapped in warmth for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to simply rest, unaware that somewhere else in the city, a decision was already being made that would change everything again, and that the peace of this one borrowed room would not last nearly as long as she hoped. The knife hit the wooden counter so hard the whole kitchen seemed to shake, and Grace nearly dropped the mug in her hands. "Sorry," said the woman who had thrown it, a stout figure with gray hair pulled into a tight bun and flour dusted across her apron. "Bread knife stubborn. Sticks in the drawer, then flies out like it's got somewhere better to be." Grace let out a breath she had not realized she was holding and set the mug down carefully. 2 weeks had passed since that first night in the garden, and she had slowly learned the rhythms of this strange, quiet house. Margaret, the woman who managed the property, had turned out to be gruff but fair, the kind of person who expressed care through the amount of food she put on a plate rather than through words. She had not asked Grace many questions in those 2 weeks. She had simply started setting a second place at the table each morning, as if Grace belonged there, as if this arrangement made perfect sense. Nothing about it made sense to Grace, and yet here she was, still in the house, wearing clothes Margaret had produced from somewhere without explanation, sleeping in the same room every night, eating meals that had begun to put color back into her face. "He's coming today," Margaret said, picking the knife back up and returning to the loaf of bread in front of her, slicing it with practiced efficiency. "Thought you should know before he walks through that door, and you jump out of your skin again." Grace's stomach tightened, an uncomfortable knot of anticipation she did not fully understand. She had not seen Dante Morty since that first night. He had, apparently, called Margaret several times to check that Grace was settling in, but he had not returned to the house himself, and Grace had begun to wonder if she had imagined the intensity of that first encounter, if perhaps the strange kindness of a stranger in the dark had simply been an aberration, a moment of impulse he now regretted. "Does he often check on you like this?" Grace asked, trying to sound casual and failing. Margaret gave her a long look, the kind that suggested she understood exactly what Grace was really asking. "No," she said simply, "he does not." She did not elaborate further, and Grace did not push, though the answer sat with her for the rest of the morning, turning over and over in her mind, while she helped Margaret air out rooms that had been closed for years, pulling white sheets off furniture to reveal handsome wood and worn velvet beneath, opening windows to let fresh air chase away the smell of dust. The house, she had learned, belonged to the Morty family, and had been the childhood home of Dante's grandmother before it passed into disuse after her death. Margaret had worked for the family for over 20 years, and though she never explained precisely what business the Mortys were in, the careful way she avoided the subject told Grace more than any direct answer could have. Grace had done her own quiet research in the evenings, using an old computer in the study that still had internet access. What she found painted a picture of a family with considerable influence across the city, a name that appeared in news articles alongside words like alleged and under investigation, always followed by statements from lawyers denying everything, always followed by charges that never seemed to stick. She had read enough to understand that Dante Morty was not simply a wealthy man. He was a dangerous one, feared by people who had reason to know exactly how dangerous he could be. And yet the man who had knelt beside her in the garden, who had spoken to her with such careful attention, who had given his word and so far kept it completely, did not fit easily into the image his reputation suggested. Grace found herself unable to reconcile the two versions of him, and the uncertainty left her feeling unsteady in a way she did not like. By late afternoon, the sound of a car on the gravel drive announced his arrival before Margaret said a word. Grace, standing in the kitchen with flour on her hands from helping prepare dinner, felt her pulse quicken despite her best effort to remain composed. Dante entered through the side door, shrugging off his coat, and for a moment he simply stood in the doorway of the kitchen, looking at Grace as though verifying she was real, that the strange choice he had made 2 weeks ago had actually resulted in the situation now in front of him. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, because something in his shoulders eased slightly. "You look better," he said. "I've been eating actual meals," Grace said, wiping her hands on a towel and trying to match his composure, though her heart continued its unreasonable pace. "Margaret is a very persuasive cook." "She has that effect on people," Dante said, and Margaret, without looking up from the stove, made a small sound that might have been amusement. Dante's gaze lingered on Grace a moment longer than necessary before he turned and moved further into the kitchen, pulling out a chair at the worn wooden table and sitting as though he had done so 1,000 times before, though Grace suspected this house had seen very little of him in recent years. "I wanted to see how you were settling in," he said. Margaret said, "You don't usually check on the house yourself." "I do not," Dante admitted, and something in his tone suggested he was as puzzled by this exception as she was. Grace sat across from him, unable to think of a graceful way to avoid the conversation, and found herself studying his face in the better light of day. He looked less like the shadow that had loomed over her in the garden, and more like an ordinary man, though the sharpness in his eyes and the careful way he held himself suggested ordinary, was a word that had never applied to him. "I looked you up," Grace said, deciding bluntness was better than pretending. "I know what people say about your family." Something flickered across his expression, not quite surprise, more like resignation. "And what do people say?" "That the Morty name is not one people say lightly. That there are things attached to it that would make most people run in the opposite direction, rather than accept a room in one of your houses." "And yet you are still here," Dante said. 2 weeks later. "I had nowhere else to go," Grace said, though even as the words left her mouth, she recognized them as only half true. She had, in the past 2 weeks, begun to reach out to a distant cousin in another city, had started to sketch the outline of a plan that might have taken her elsewhere if she had pushed harder. She had not pushed harder. Some part of her had wanted to stay, had wanted to understand this strange man and the equally strange kindness he had shown her, and admitting that felt more dangerous than any rumor she had read about his family. "You are lying," Dante said, though there was no accusation in his voice, only quiet observation. "You could have left already. You have not." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, unable to argue with the truth of it. "Why does it matter to you either way?" "It does not have to matter," Dante said, "but it does." The simplicity of the admission hung in the air between them, and Grace found herself unable to look away from him, caught in a moment that felt far more significant than the ordinary kitchen around them suggested it should be. Margaret, sensing something in the silence, quietly excused herself to check on something in the pantry, leaving the two of them alone at the table. "I do not understand you," Grace admitted finally. "The world says you are a man people should fear, but you have done nothing except give me a room and ask nothing in return." "The world is not entirely wrong," Dante said, his voice quiet but honest in a way that surprised her. "I have done things, Grace, that would justify every fear anyone has ever had of my name. I will not pretend otherwise to make myself more comfortable to be near." He paused, and something in his expression grew more careful, as though he were choosing his next words with unusual precision. "But I have also spent most of my life surrounded by people who tell me only what they think I want to hear, who smile at me because they are afraid of what happens if they do not. You looked at me in that garden like I was simply a man standing in your way, nothing more. It has been a very long time since anyone looked at me like that." The honesty of it settled something in Grace's chest, a tension she had not realized she was carrying since that first night. She thought of her own life before everything collapsed, of the easy way she used to speak her mind to customers and neighbors alike, of the confidence that had been slowly stripped away by months of survival and fear. She recognized, in Dante's words, an echo of her own loneliness, different in its causes but familiar in its shape. "I am not interested in being afraid of you," Grace said, "but I am not foolish either. I know what kind of world you live in, even if I don't know all the details of it." "That is fair," Dante said. "I would not ask you to be foolish." "Then what are you asking?" He considered the question for a long moment, and Grace watched him search for an answer that satisfied even himself. "I do not entirely know," he admitted finally. "I only know that I would like you to stay a while longer, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because I find I would prefer it if you did." Grace's breath caught, and she was suddenly aware of every small detail of the kitchen around her. The smell of bread cooling on the counter, the late afternoon light slanting through the windows, the careful, unguarded way Dante was watching her, waiting for her answer as though it mattered more than any decision he made in whatever dangerous world he ruled beyond this house. "I'll stay a while longer," she said finally, and watched something in his posture relax, just slightly, the barest easing of tension she suspected very few people ever saw in him. The weeks that followed fell into a new kind of rhythm. Dante's visits became more frequent, sometimes brief, sometimes lasting an entire evening, and each time he arrived, Grace found herself looking forward to it in a way she was reluctant to fully examine. They talked about small things at first, books she found in the study, memories of her mother's bakery, stories Dante told, carefully edited, about growing up in his grandmother's house before duty pulled him into the family business. She learned that he was more thoughtful than his reputation suggested, that he listened more than he spoke, that he had a dry sense of humor he rarely showed anyone, if Margaret's occasional surprised laughter at something he said was any indication. She learned that he never raised his voice, that his calm was not the calm of someone without feeling, but of someone who had learned, out of necessity, to control feeling completely. She also began to notice things that made her uneasy. Men arrived at the estate sometimes, speaking to Dante in low voices in rooms she was not invited into. Once, she saw him return late at night with a torn sleeve and a look on his face that made her decide not to ask what had happened. The world he lived in continued to press against the edges of the peaceful bubble they had built inside this house, and Grace understood, with a clarity that unsettled her, that eventually that world would find a way inside. She did not yet know that someone had already begun looking for a way to do exactly that. Victor Morty, Dante's cousin, arrived at the estate on a gray afternoon nearly a month after Grace had first been found sleeping in the garden. Grace was in the kitchen when she heard his voice in the hallway, smooth and pleasant in a way that immediately put her on edge, an instinct she could not fully explain but trusted anyway. "So this is where you have been disappearing to," Victor said, stepping into the kitchen with an easy smile that did not reach his eyes. He was similar to Dante in build, with the same dark hair, though his features lacked the quiet steadiness that made Dante's presence feel grounded rather than threatening. Victor's presence felt calculated, every gesture designed for effect. Dante mentioned he had a guest. He did not mention how charming she was. "Victor," Dante said from the doorway, his voice carrying a warning Grace had not heard him use before. "Grace, this is my cousin." "A pleasure," Victor said, extending a hand Grace shook out of politeness rather than genuine welcome. His grip lingered a moment longer than necessary, and his eyes moved over her with an assessment that felt entirely different from the careful attention Dante gave her, more calculating, more hungry for information he could use. "How long have you been staying with my cousin, Grace?" Victor asked, settling into a chair without being invited, his casualness a performance Grace did not trust for a second. "A few weeks," Grace said carefully. "And where were you before that?" "Victor," Dante said again, sharper this time. "I am only curious," Victor said, holding up his hands in mock surrender, though the smile never left his face. "It is not every day my cousin brings a stranger into the family home. Forgive me for wanting to know a little more about the woman who has captured so much of his attention." Grace felt the weight of his gaze and understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever pleasant surface Victor presented, there was something far less pleasant beneath it. She glanced at Dante and saw his jaw tighten, saw the careful way he positioned himself slightly between her and his cousin, a small gesture that told her more about the true nature of Victor Morty than anything either man had said aloud. "I should get back to helping Margaret," Grace said, excusing herself as gracefully as she could manage, though she felt Victor's eyes follow her all the way out of the room. Behind her, she heard Dante's voice drop low, sharp words exchanged between the two men that she could not fully make out, though the tension in them was unmistakable. Margaret, finding Grace in the pantry a few minutes later, gave her a knowing look. "That one," Margaret said quietly, nodding toward the kitchen, "has never brought anything but trouble into this family. You would do well to stay careful around him." Grace nodded, though the warning did little to settle the uneasy feeling that had taken root in her chest since Victor's arrival. She did not yet know what plans were already forming behind his pleasant smile, did not know that her past, the very details she had shared so carefully with Dante alone, was about to become a thread Victor intended to pull until everything unraveled. That night, long after Victor had finally left the estate, and Dante had gone with him to attend to whatever business required his attention, Grace lay awake in her room, listening to the wind move through the garden below her window. She thought of the careful way Dante had positioned himself between her and his cousin, of the warning in Margaret's voice, of the growing certainty that the peace she had found in this house was far more fragile than she wanted to believe. Somewhere in the city, in a room she would never see, Victor Morty was already making calls, already gathering information, already beginning to construct a plan that would use Grace as a weapon against the cousin he had resented for years. And though Grace could not have known the details of what was coming, some instinct deep inside her, the same instinct that had once told her not to trust Edmund Price's smiling promises, whispered now that the storm gathering around this house was only just beginning. The glass shattered against the wall inches from Grace's head, and she flinched so hard she knocked over the chair she had been standing near. "Careful," said the man who had thrown it, though there was nothing careful in his tone, nothing but cold amusement as he watched her scramble backward. He was a stranger, broad-shouldered and hard-eyed, standing in the doorway of the study as though he owned it, and Grace understood in an instant that whoever he was, he had not come to the estate with good intentions. "Who are you?" she demanded, though her voice shook more than she wanted it to. "How did you get in here?" "Adrian Cole," the man said, stepping fully into the room, his boots crunching over broken glass. "And your gate, sweetheart, is not nearly as secure as your friend Dante believes it to be." Grace's mind raced, cataloging exits, weighing her chances, but before she could move, Adrian crossed the distance between them faster than she thought possible and gripped her arm hard enough to bruise. "You are going to come with me," he said. "And if Dante Morty wants you back in one piece, he is going to think very carefully about how he has been running his business lately." Grace twisted against his grip, adrenaline overriding the fear that had frozen her only seconds before, and drove her elbow back hard into his ribs. The strike caught him off guard, loosening his hold just enough for her to break free and bolt for the hallway, her bare feet slapping against cold stone as she ran. This was not how the last 2 months were supposed to end. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that danger lived at the edges of the life she had built inside the Morty estate. She had seen the tension between Dante and Victor grow sharper each week, had heard Margaret's warnings, had watched Dante return from meetings with a tightness around his eyes he tried and failed to hide from her. But knowing danger existed in theory was nothing compared to feeling a stranger's hand close around her arm in her own borrowed home. She reached the main hall and nearly collided with Margaret, who took one look at Grace's face and the blood on her lip, and understood immediately that something had gone terribly wrong. "Kitchen," Margaret said, already moving, pulling Grace toward the back of the house. "There is a phone in the pantry. Go, now." Grace did not argue. She ran, her heart pounding so violently she could hear it over her own footsteps, and had just reached the pantry door when Adrian's voice echoed through the hallway behind her, closer than she expected, his patience clearly exhausted. "There is nowhere in this house you can hide," he called, his voice carrying an ugly satisfaction that made Grace's skin crawl. "Dante is not even here to save you." Grace's hands shook as she grabbed the phone, fumbling with the buttons, uncertain even who to call, whether Dante would answer, whether calling him would only make things worse. She had barely managed to dial the number Margaret had once given her for emergencies when the pantry door swung open and Adrian filled the frame, a cold smile spreading across his face. "Clever girl," he said, "but not clever enough." He reached for her, and Grace threw the nearest thing she could find, a heavy jar of preserved fruit, catching him across the temple hard enough to make him stagger. It bought her only seconds, but seconds were enough to duck past him and back into the hallway, where Margaret was waiting with something Grace had not expected to see in the older woman's hands. A gun, held with the steady confidence of someone who had held one before. "Get behind me," Margaret said, and Grace, too shocked to argue, obeyed instantly. Adrian emerged from the pantry, blood trickling from a cut above his eye, and stopped short at the sight of the weapon aimed steadily at his chest. "This is not your fight, old woman." "You are standing in my kitchen," Margaret said, her voice utterly calm despite the tension coiled in every line of her body. "That makes it exactly my fight." For a long, breathless moment, nobody moved. Then, somewhere outside, the sound of car doors slamming and multiple sets of footsteps crossing gravel broke the standoff, and Adrian's expression shifted, calculation replacing confidence as he realized the odds had suddenly changed against him. "This is not finished," he said, backing toward the side door, his eyes never leaving Margaret's steady aim. "Tell Dante this is only the beginning." He disappeared through the door just as Dante himself burst through the front entrance, several of his men trailing behind him, his expression carrying a fury Grace had never seen on him before, sharp and dangerous in a way that reminded her, suddenly and completely, of exactly what kind of man she had chosen to trust. "Grace," he said, crossing the hallway in seconds, his hands finding her shoulders, checking her for injury with an urgency that cut through the last of her adrenaline and left her shaking. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Grace managed, though her voice betrayed how far from fine she actually felt. "He wanted to use me against you. He said Margaret couldn't stop him, but she did. She had a gun, Dante." "She just had a gun." "I have had one for 20 years, Margaret said, setting the weapon down on the counter with the casual air of someone putting away a kitchen tool. "This family does not employ people who cannot protect themselves, or the house they are asked to protect." Dante's jaw tightened, and Grace watched something pass between him and Margaret, an unspoken understanding that this incident, whatever it truly meant, would not be forgotten or dismissed. He turned back to Grace, his hands still resting on her shoulders as though he needed the physical proof that she was safe. "That was Adrian Cole," he said. "He works for a family that has wanted my territory for years. If he came here, it means someone told him you were important to me." "Victor," Grace said, the name settling into place with sickening certainty even as she spoke it. "He was the only one who saw us together, the only one who asked so many questions." Dante's expression darkened further, though this time the fury seemed directed inward at himself, at a betrayal he had perhaps suspected but not wanted to believe. "I need to speak with him," he said, more to himself than to her. "Not tonight," Grace said, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. "Tonight I need you to stay here. Whatever war is happening between you, it can wait until morning." For a moment she thought he might argue, might insist that duty required him elsewhere despite everything that had just happened. Instead, something in her words seemed to reach him, and the tension in his shoulders eased just slightly as he nodded. "One night," he agreed, "but this will not wait longer than that." That night, after Margaret had checked every lock in the house twice and Dante's men had taken positions around the property, Grace sat with Dante in the study, the broken glass swept away, the fire lit against the chill that had settled into the old stone walls. Neither of them spoke for a long while, the silence heavy with everything that had nearly happened. "You could have died tonight," Dante said finally, his voice quiet in a way she had not heard from him before. "Because of me, because of who I am and what I have built my life around." "I chose to stay," Grace said. "That was my decision, not something you did to me." "You did not choose to be dragged into a war you have nothing to do with," Dante said. "I should have sent you somewhere safe the moment Victor showed interest in you. Instead, I let myself believe I could keep you protected here in my own house, and I nearly cost you your life for that mistake." Grace reached across the space between them and took his hand, an act of comfort that surprised them both with its simplicity. "You did not make me stay," she said. "You gave me a choice every single time, and I chose this. I chose you. If that means facing danger I did not expect, then it is still my choice to face it." Dante looked at her then with an intensity that made her breath catch, something raw and unguarded in his expression that she had glimpsed only in fragments before tonight. "I have spent my whole life building walls around myself," he said, "around anyone who might be used against me. I told myself it was safer that way, for everyone. And then I found you sleeping in my grandmother's garden, and every wall I had built started coming down without my permission." "Is that a complaint?" Grace asked softly. "It is a confession," Dante said. "I do not know how to protect you and keep you close at the same time. Every instinct in me says the two things cannot exist together. But the thought of sending you away feels worse than any danger Victor or Adrian could bring to this door." Grace felt something in her chest tighten and release all at once, a feeling too large and complicated to name easily. She thought of the woman she had been a year ago, running her bakery, believing the world was simpler than it turned out to be, and she thought of the woman sitting here now, in a study warmed by firelight, holding the hand of a man whose world was built on danger and loyalty, and secrets she was only beginning to understand. "Then don't send me away," she said. "Let me stay. Let us figure out the rest together." Dante's hand tightened around hers, and for a long moment neither of them said anything else, the fire crackling softly in the quiet room, the danger outside the walls held, for now, at bay. But even as Grace allowed herself this small moment of peace, she understood that Adrian's warning still hung over them, unresolved and waiting. "This is not finished," he had said, and something in Grace's instincts told her he had meant every word. The following morning, Dante left before dawn to confront Victor, his expression carrying a coldness Grace had never witnessed in him before, a warning of exactly how far he was prepared to go to protect what he now considered his. Grace watched him go from the window of her room, her stomach twisted with worry, uncertain what confrontation was unfolding somewhere across the city, uncertain whether the fragile peace between the two men could survive what had happened the night before. She did not yet know that Victor, sensing his exposure, had already begun making arrangements of his own, reaching out to Adrian Cole once more, offering information far more dangerous than anything he had shared before, information about the estate's defenses, about Dante's routines, about the precise moment when the house would be most vulnerable. The storm that had brushed against the estate the previous night had only been the first warning. The true reckoning was still to come, and when it arrived, it would test everything Grace and Dante had built between them, forcing both of them to confront exactly how far they were willing to go to protect each other, and exactly what price that protection might demand. Margaret found Grace still standing at the window long after Dante's car had disappeared down the drive, and the old woman's expression, usually so composed, carried a rare flicker of concern. "He will handle Victor," Margaret said, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. "But you should know, child, that men like Victor Morty do not simply accept defeat. When they are cornered, they become more dangerous, not less." Grace nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the empty drive, and felt the fragile warmth of the night before give way to a colder, more urgent fear. "What will happen to him?" she asked. "Victor, I mean. If Dante confronts him and he cannot prove what he did." Margaret considered the question carefully, choosing her words the way she always did, with the patience of someone who had spent decades learning what to say and what to leave unspoken. "Proof does not always matter in this world the way it does in courtrooms," she said. "Dante will know the truth simply by watching how Victor answers him. Men who lie carry it in their eyes, in the pauses before they speak. Dante has known his cousin his whole life. He will not be fooled easily. And if Victor denies it convincingly enough, then Dante will watch him more closely than he has ever watched anyone," Margaret said. "And Victor, whether he knows it or not, will have already lost something far more valuable than an argument. He will have lost the last of his cousin's trust." Grace turned from the window and moved toward the kitchen, needing something to occupy her hands while her mind continued to circle the danger that had entered the house the night before. Margaret joined her, and together they worked in near silence, kneading dough that did not truly need kneading, sweeping a floor that was already clean, both women finding comfort in motion rather than stillness. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said eventually, breaking the quiet. "You have worked for this family for 20 years. You have seen the danger up close again and again. Why do you stay?" Margaret's hands paused over the counter, and for a moment, something old and complicated passed behind her eyes. "Because loyalty is not something you give only when it is convenient," she said. "Dante's grandmother took me in when I had nowhere else to go, much the way Dante took you in. I promised her I would look after this family, and I intend to keep that promise until I no longer can. Danger is simply the price of loyalty in this world. I decided a long time ago it was a price worth paying." Grace absorbed the words slowly, recognizing in them an echo of her own choice. The same quiet decision she had made the night before when she told Dante she wanted to stay despite everything. She wondered if this was simply what loyalty looked like once fear had been faced and survived. A choice renewed again and again rather than made only once. The morning stretched into afternoon, and still Dante did not return. Grace found herself checking the window every few minutes, unable to fully settle into any task, her mind conjuring increasingly troubling images of what confrontation might be unfolding between the two cousins. She thought of Victor's easy smile, the calculated warmth that had never once reached his eyes, and wondered how a man capable of such careful deception would respond to being cornered by someone who had known him his entire life. When the sound of tires on gravel finally broke the tense quiet of late afternoon, Grace was at the door before she had consciously decided to move, her heart lifting, and then immediately tightening again at the sight of Dante's face as he stepped out of the car. Whatever had happened between him and Victor, it had left its mark, a hardness around his eyes that had not been there that morning, a weariness in the set of his shoulders that spoke of a confrontation far more difficult than she had imagined. "What happened?" Grace asked, meeting him halfway across the gravel drive. "He denied everything," Dante said, his voice flat with barely controlled anger. "Just as Margaret predicted. He looked me in the eye and told me he had no idea how Adrian Cole learned about you, that the accusation was insulting, that I was allowing my judgment to be clouded by feelings that had no place in our family's business." "Do you believe him?" Dante's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing, staring past her toward the house as though seeking an answer in its ivy-covered walls. "No," he said finally, "I do not believe him, but I have no proof strong enough to act on yet, which means for now I have to watch him. And you have to be more careful than ever." Grace felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cooling afternoon air. If Victor was clever enough to deny everything convincingly, clever enough to make even his own cousin hesitate, then the danger he represented had not been reduced by the confrontation. If anything, Grace understood with growing certainty, it had simply become more hidden, more patient, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. The lights went out all at once, plunging the entire house into darkness, and Grace froze in the middle of the hallway with a stack of clean linen still in her arms. For a moment, she told herself it was only a storm, that the wind she had heard picking up outside had finally taken down a power line somewhere. Then she heard the distant sound of glass breaking at the back of the house, followed by hurried footsteps that did not belong to Margaret, and every instinct in her body screamed that this was not an accident at all. She dropped the linens and moved toward the study, where Dante had shown her weeks ago a hidden panel behind one of the bookshelves, a small space built into the old walls for exactly this kind of emergency. Her hands shook as she felt along the wood in the darkness, finally finding the catch and pulling it open just as the sound of multiple footsteps grew closer, spreading through the house with the coordinated efficiency of people who had planned this carefully. It had been 3 weeks since Victor's denial, 3 weeks of watchfulness that had gradually, dangerously, begun to soften into something like normal life again. Dante had increased security around the estate, had spoken quietly with men Grace did not know, had seemed, in recent days, cautiously convinced that the immediate threat had passed. Grace had allowed herself to believe it too, had allowed herself to enjoy quiet evenings with Dante in the study, long walks through the garden that had slowly been reclaimed from years of neglect, the fragile beginning of something that felt, despite everything, like happiness. She understood now, crouched in the dark behind the bookshelf with her heart pounding against her ribs, how foolish that comfort had been. Footsteps entered the study, and Grace held her breath, pressing herself as far back into the small space as the walls allowed. Through the narrow gap in the panel, she caught a glimpse of a figure moving through the room, illuminated briefly by the beam of a flashlight, and recognized, with a jolt of cold fear, the broad shoulders and hard eyes of Adrian Cole. "She has to be here somewhere," he said to someone unseen, his voice carrying the same ugly satisfaction she remembered from their first encounter. "Victor said she rarely leaves the property these days." Morty has gotten soft, thinking he could keep her safe with a few extra guns at the gate. A second voice answered from further away, muffled by distance, and Grace strained to hear anything useful, any hint of how many people had entered the house, any indication of where Dante and Margaret might be. She thought of the gun Margaret had produced so calmly the last time danger arrived at this door, and desperately hoped the older woman was somewhere safe, or better yet, somewhere she could use that same calm competence to turn the tide of whatever was happening. Adrian moved closer to the bookshelf, and Grace's pulse spiked as his flashlight beam swept across the room, coming dangerously close to the narrow gap she was watching through. She pressed her hand over her own mouth, forcing her breathing to slow, forcing herself to remain utterly still despite every instinct urging her to run. Then from somewhere else in the house, a gunshot rang out, sharp and sudden, followed by shouting, and Adrian's attention snapped away from the study, his flashlight beam swinging toward the door. "Cover the back," he snapped to his unseen companion, already moving toward the sound of the disturbance. "I want her found before Morty gets back from wherever he wandered off to." The moment his footsteps faded from the room, Grace forced herself to move, easing the panel open just enough to slip out, her whole body trembling with the effort of staying quiet. She needed to find another way out of the house, needed to reach Dante or Margaret or anyone who could help her survive whatever was unfolding in the darkness around her. She crept toward the hallway, staying low, her bare feet silent against the old wood floor, and had nearly reached the back staircase when a hand closed around her arm from behind. She spun, ready to fight, and found herself face to face not with an enemy but with Margaret, the older woman's face grim in the dim emergency light that had begun to flicker back to life along the baseboards. "This way," Margaret whispered, pulling Grace toward a narrow servant's staircase Grace had never noticed before, tucked behind a door disguised as part of the paneling. "Dante is dealing with the men at the front gate. We need to get you somewhere they will not think to look." They moved quickly and quietly down the narrow stairs, emerging into a section of the cellar Grace had never explored, lined with old wine racks and forgotten furniture draped in dust sheets. Margaret led her to a heavy door at the far end, unlocking it with a key from her pocket, revealing a small room that had clearly been prepared for exactly this kind of situation, stocked with supplies, a single dim lamp, a radio. "Stay here," Margaret said, pressing the radio into Grace's hands. "If anyone other than Dante or myself opens that door, use this to call for help, and do not hesitate to defend yourself with whatever you can find. Do you understand?" Grace nodded, though the reality of what Margaret was suggesting settled into her stomach like ice. "Where are you going?" "To help Dante," Margaret said simply, already turning back toward the stairs. "This is not the first time this house has needed defending, child. It will not be the last. Stay hidden. Stay safe. That is your part in this." She disappeared back up the narrow staircase before Grace could argue, leaving her alone in the small hidden room, the radio clutched tight in her shaking hands, the sound of distant shouting and occasional gunfire filtering faintly through the old stone walls. Grace did not know how long she crouched there, counting her own heartbeats, straining to interpret every distant sound for some sign of how the battle above her was unfolding. She thought of Dante, of the fierce protectiveness she had seen in him since that first night in the garden, and prayed, with an intensity she had not felt in years, that whatever training and preparation this dangerous world had given him would be enough to bring him back to her safely. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Grace tried the radio once, her fingers hovering over the switch, but Margaret's instructions echoed in her mind, and she forced herself to wait, to trust that calling out unnecessarily might draw danger toward her rather than help. Instead, she paced the small confines of the hidden room, running her hands along the cold stone walls, listening for any change in the muffled sounds filtering down from above. She thought of her mother, gone 3 years now, and wondered what the woman who had taught her to knead bread with patient, steady hands would think of the life Grace now found herself living. She thought of the bakery, of Edmund Price's smiling lies, of every choice that had led her, step by impossible step, from a stone bench in an abandoned garden to a hidden cellar room beneath a mafia boss's house, while gunfire echoed somewhere above her. She did not regret any of it. That realization struck her with unexpected force, even as fear continued to coil tight in her chest. Whatever danger this life carried, it had also given her Dante's quiet honesty, Margaret's fierce protectiveness, a sense of belonging she had not felt since her mother's bakery still stood on its familiar corner. She would not trade that, not even for the false safety of a life without him in it. A distant crash sounded from somewhere above, followed by more shouting, closer this time, and Grace's grip tightened around the iron candlestick she had taken from a shelf near the door. She positioned herself where Margaret had shown her, angled so that anyone entering would not immediately see her, ready to strike if the door opened to reveal an enemy rather than an ally. The sound of the radio crackling to life nearly made her drop the candlestick entirely. Margaret's voice came through, tense but steady. "Grace, stay where you are, it is almost finished." Grace pressed the radio to her ear, straining to hear anything beneath the static. "Is Dante safe?" There was a pause before Margaret's voice returned, and in that brief silence Grace felt her heart stop entirely. "He is fighting," Margaret said finally. "He is alive. That is all I can tell you right now. Stay hidden." The radio went silent again, and Grace forced herself to breathe, to remain in place despite every instinct screaming at her to run upstairs and see for herself whether the man she had come to love was truly safe. She had never allowed herself to use that word before, not even privately, not even in the quiet of her own thoughts. But crouched in a hidden room with danger raging somewhere above her, she found she could no longer deny it. She loved Dante Morty, dangerous world and all, and the thought of losing him now, after everything they had survived together, was more unbearable than any fear she had carried through her months of homelessness. Another 20 minutes passed in tense silence before she heard footsteps on the stairs again, careful and measured, followed by a voice she recognized instantly. "Grace, it's me." She nearly wept with relief at the sound of Dante's voice, though she held the candlestick steady until she saw his face clearly in the doorway, confirming it was truly him and not some trick. The door swung open fully, and the sight of Dante standing there, disheveled and breathing hard but unmistakably alive, sent the candlestick clattering from her hands as she crossed the room and threw herself against him without a second thought. "You're alive," she said, her voice breaking on the words, her hands gripping the front of his shirt as though she needed physical proof he was truly there. "I'm alive," Dante confirmed, his arms wrapping around her tightly, his own voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Adrian's men are gone. Most of them will not be coming back to try this again." "And Adrian himself." Something dark crossed Dante's expression. "He escaped, but he will not escape what comes next. Not after tonight." Grace pulled back enough to look at him properly, taking in the small cuts along his jaw, the way he held one arm slightly guarded against his side, evidence of a fight far more brutal than his controlled tone suggested. "You're hurt." "It is nothing," Dante said, though the tightness around his eyes suggested otherwise. "Grace, I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand how serious it is." She waited, her heart still racing, as he drew a steadying breath. "Victor gave Adrian the layout of this house," Dante said. "The location of the hidden panel in the study, the timing of the guard rotations at the gate, details only someone with intimate knowledge of this property could have provided. There is no more room for doubt." My cousin tried to have you taken from this house tonight, and if his plan had gone differently, I do not know what might have happened to you." Grace felt the full weight of the danger she had narrowly escaped settle over her, cold and heavy. "What will you do?" "What I should have done 3 weeks ago," Dante said, his voice carrying a finality that left no room for argument. "Victor has made his choice clear tonight. Now I will make mine equally clear to him." The following morning, word spread through the estate that Victor Morty had been summoned to answer for his betrayal in front of the men whose respect and loyalty had, until now, allowed him to move freely within the family's circles. Grace, still shaken from the night before, watched from the window as cars began arriving throughout the morning, dark and purposeful, carrying men whose faces she recognized from previous visits, all of them gathering for a reckoning that had been building since the night Grace was first found sleeping among the roses. Margaret found her at the window again, much as she had weeks earlier, though this time her expression carried something closer to grim satisfaction than concern. "It is time," Margaret said, "time for Victor to answer for everything he has done. And time, I think, for this house to finally be free of the shadow he has cast over it for far too long." Grace nodded slowly, watching the gathering below, aware that whatever happened in the confrontation to come would shape not only Dante's future within his own family, but the fragile, precious thing that had begun growing between the two of them since that first cold night in the garden. She thought of everything she had survived to reach this point, the loss of her bakery, the months of sleeping wherever she could find shelter, the terrifying uncertainty of trusting a stranger who turned out to hold more danger and more tenderness than she could have imagined. Whatever came next, she understood she would face it not as the frightened woman who had once curled up on a cold stone bench with nowhere else to turn, but as someone who had chosen, deliberately and completely, to stand beside Dante Morty through whatever storm his world demanded they weather together. Dante found her still at the window an hour later, dressed now in a dark suit that made him look every inch the man his reputation described, though his eyes softened the moment they found her. "You do not have to be part of this," he said quietly. "What happens downstairs today will not be pleasant. You could stay up here away from it." Grace turned from the window and met his gaze steadily. "I have spent the last 2 nights hiding in cellars and behind bookshelves because of what Victor set in motion," she said. "I am done hiding, Dante. If you are facing him today, I want to stand where I can see it happen." Something shifted in Dante's expression, a flicker of surprise quickly giving way to something that looked almost like pride. "He will try to turn the room against you if he can," Dante warned. "He will say things meant to make the men present doubt your place here, doubt my judgment for bringing you into this house at all." "Let him try," Grace said. "I am not afraid of his words anymore. I have seen what hides behind them." Dante studied her for a long moment, and then, without a word, extended his hand. Grace took it, and together they walked down through the quiet house, past Margaret, who fell into step slightly behind them with the same steady watchfulness she had shown since the night Grace first arrived, past the men gathered in the hallway who straightened as Dante passed, their expressions carrying a respect Grace had not fully appreciated until she saw it directed at him in full. At the entrance to the main hall, Dante paused and looked at her one final time. "Once this begins, there is no undoing it," he said. "Victor will no longer be family after today. Whatever protection that name once gave him ends the moment I speak the words in front of these men." "He gave that protection up himself," Grace said, "the night he told Adrian Cole where to find me." Dante nodded once, some final resolve settling over his features, and pushed open the heavy doors leading into the hall where Victor already waited, flanked by 2 men Grace did not recognize, his usual easy smile nowhere in sight. The air in the room felt charged, heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold, and Grace felt Dante's hand tighten briefly around hers before he released it and stepped forward alone, exactly as this world demanded he must. The reckoning was coming, and Grace, for the first time in longer than she could remember, did not intend to hide from it. Victor's smile vanished the instant Dante's men closed the doors behind him, sealing the hall shut, and for the first time since Grace had met him, she saw something close to real fear flicker across his composed features. "This is unnecessary theater," Victor said, though his voice lacked its usual smooth confidence. "Whatever you believe I have done, Dante, we are family. This is not how family settles disagreements." "You stopped being family the moment you gave Adrian Cole the layout of this house," Dante said, his voice carrying across the silent hall with a cold authority Grace had not heard from him before. "The moment you told him when the guards changed shifts, where the hidden panel in the study led, exactly how to find the one person in this house you knew I would do anything to protect." A murmur moved through the gathered men, and Grace watched Victor's eyes dart toward them, calculating, searching for some ally among the faces that had once respected him. He found none. Whatever loyalty he had once commanded had clearly eroded long before this moment, worn away by years of ambition too poorly hidden to remain unnoticed. "You have no proof of any of this," Victor said, though the words came out weaker than his previous denials. "I have Adrian Cole," Dante said, and Grace watched surprise ripple across Victor's face at those words. "He was captured last night trying to flee the estate after his men failed to accomplish what you promised him would be simple. He has already told my people everything, Victor, every detail, every conversation, every payment you made to buy his cooperation." The color drained from Victor's face, and for a long moment the hall held nothing but silence, thick and suffocating, as the last of his defenses crumbled visibly before everyone watching. Grace, standing slightly behind Dante, felt no satisfaction in the sight, only a quiet, steady relief that the danger which had shadowed her since Victor's first pleasant, calculating smile was finally being drawn fully into the light. "I did it for this family," Victor said finally, his voice rising, something desperate entering his tone now that denial was no longer an option. "You have let this outsider distract you from everything that matters, Dante. Our territory, our alliances, decisions that require a clear head, not one clouded by feelings for a woman you know nothing about. I was protecting what our grandfather built." "You were protecting your own ambition," Dante said, unmoved by the accusation. "You have wanted my position for years, Victor. Grace simply became the excuse you needed to finally act on it. If Adrian had succeeded in taking her, you would have used my grief and my anger to seize control, while I was distracted by chaos of your own making." Victor's jaw tightened, and for a moment Grace thought he might attempt some final argument, some last desperate bid to salvage his position. Instead, something in him seemed to accept the inevitability of what was coming, his shoulders sagging slightly as the fight drained out of him. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "You will leave," Dante said. "Tonight. You will take nothing that belongs to this family, and you will never set foot on any property connected to the Morty name again. The men in this room will make certain that every associate, every ally, every business connection we hold understands exactly why. Your name will carry no weight anywhere I have influence, which is to say, nearly everywhere that matters." "You would exile your own cousin," Victor said, though there was no real surprise in his voice, only the bitter acknowledgement of consequences he had perhaps always known might eventually arrive. "You exiled yourself," Dante said, "the moment you decided my grandmother's kindness meant nothing compared to your own ambition." The finality in his voice left no room for further argument. Two of Dante's men stepped forward, and Victor, recognizing the pointlessness of resistance, allowed himself to be led from the hall without further protest, his earlier confidence replaced entirely by the hollow posture of a man watching everything he had schemed for collapse in a single afternoon. As he passed Grace on his way toward the doors, He paused just long enough to meet her eyes. "I hope he is worth what you have chosen," Victor said quietly, no longer performing for an audience, his voice carrying something almost like genuine bitterness. "He is," Grace said simply, and watched something in Victor's expression flicker before he turned and walked away, out of the hall and out of the life he had once believed belonged entirely to him. The doors closed behind him, and the tension that had filled the room began, slowly, to dissolve. The gathered men spoke quietly among themselves, some clearly relieved, others simply processing the shift in power that had just unfolded in front of them. Dante turned to Grace, and for the first time since the confrontation began, the hard authority in his expression softened into something far more familiar, far more like the man who had knelt beside her in the garden all those weeks ago. "It is finished," he said quietly. "Is it?" Grace asked. "Truly." "Adrian Cole will face consequences for what he attempted here," Dante said. "Victor will no longer have the influence or the family protection to cause trouble of this kind again. It is not a perfect ending, Grace. This world rarely offers perfect endings. But it is finished, as much as anything in my life can be." Grace felt the weight of the last 2 months settle over her all at once. Every fear, every uncertainty, every quiet moment of growing trust that had brought her to this hall, standing beside a man whose world had once terrified her and now felt, impossibly, like the only place she wanted to be. She thought of the frightened woman who had woken to a stranger's hand around her ankle in an abandoned garden, and understood how completely that woman had changed in the weeks since. Later that evening, after the last of Dante's men had departed and the great house had settled back into its usual quiet, Grace found him in the garden, standing among the roses that Margaret's careful tending had slowly coaxed back to life over the past 2 months. The overgrown wildness that had first hidden Grace from the world had given way, bit by bit, to something closer to the beauty the garden must have held decades ago, when Dante's grandmother still walked these paths herself. "I owe you an explanation," Dante said, hearing her approach without turning. "For that first night, I have never fully told you why I offered you shelter instead of simply having you removed from the property." "You don't owe me anything," Grace said, coming to stand beside him. "You already gave me everything I needed that night." "I want to tell you anyway," Dante said, finally turning to face her, something vulnerable in his expression that she had rarely seen from him, even in their most honest conversations. "When I found you sleeping here, I expected to feel nothing but irritation at the inconvenience. Instead, I saw someone who had lost everything and was still refusing to beg for anything from a stranger. You looked at me with more defiance than fear, even though you had every reason to be afraid. I do not know how to explain it except to say that in that single moment, you reminded me of what it felt like to be a person, rather than a name people either feared or tried to use. I had forgotten, somewhere along the way, that such a feeling was even possible for someone like me." Grace felt tears rise unexpectedly in her eyes, the weight of his words settling into places she had not realized still ached with old loneliness. "I felt something similar," she admitted. "Everyone else who found me sleeping somewhere I did not belong looked at me like a problem to be solved or ignored. You looked at me like a person worth understanding. I did not expect that. Not from anyone, and certainly not from a stranger in the dark." Dante reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch careful in a way that contrasted sharply with the ruthless authority she had witnessed in the hall earlier that day. "I know this life is not easy," he said. "I know what I am, what my family has built, the dangers that will likely follow us even now that Victor and Adrian are dealt with. I cannot promise you a simple life, Grace. I can only promise that I will never stop choosing you, exactly as I chose to offer you shelter that first night." "I am not asking for simple," Grace said. "I gave up believing in simple a long time ago, back when Edmund Price took everything I thought I understood about the world. What I am asking for is honest, and you have been nothing but honest with me since the night we met, even when honesty was not easy to offer. Dante's hand moved to cup her face gently, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the quiet of the restored garden settling around them like a blessing neither had expected to receive. "Stay," he said finally, the same word he had offered weeks ago, though it carried a different weight now, deeper and more certain. "Not because you have nowhere else to go, not out of necessity or convenience. Stay because this is where you choose to be." "I already told you," Grace said, a small smile breaking through despite the tears still gathered in her eyes. "I chose you. That has not changed, and it is not going to change now that the danger has passed." Dante's answering smile was rare and real, transforming his usually guarded features into something Grace suspected very few people had ever been privileged to witness. He drew her close, and for the first time since that terrifying, life-altering night in the garden, Grace allowed herself to fully believe in the possibility of a future she had once thought completely out of reach. In the weeks that followed, the estate slowly transformed from a place of hidden danger into something closer to a true home. Margaret continued her fierce, quiet care over the household, her presence a steady comfort that had become as essential to Grace as Dante's own. The garden bloomed fuller with each passing week, roses climbing once more over restored trellises, the wildness that had first hidden Grace giving way to a carefully tended beauty that mirrored the transformation in her own life. Grace began, slowly and carefully, to rebuild pieces of the life that had been taken from her, using skills she had never fully lost despite everything she had suffered. With Margaret's help, she reopened a small kitchen in a quiet corner of the estate, filling it once more with the smell of fresh bread, a quiet echo of the bakery she had lost, rebuilt not out of desperate necessity but out of genuine joy rediscovered. Dante watched this transformation with quiet pride, understanding that the woman standing beside him now was not the same frightened, defeated figure he had found sleeping among the roses months earlier, but someone who had reclaimed her own strength, choosing this life alongside him not out of desperation, but out of genuine, hard-won love. On a warm evening many weeks later, as the garden settled into the golden light of sunset, Dante led Grace to the very bench where he had first found her sleeping, now surrounded by roses in full, glorious bloom. He did not say much, simply reached for her hand and held it, the two of them watching the last light fade over the restored beauty of a garden that had once been a symbol of neglect, and now stood as proof of everything that could be rebuilt when someone chose, against every reasonable fear, to stay. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely at peace. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" she asked quietly. "When I asked why you were offering a stranger a room in your house, you told me you were not most people." "I remember," Dante said, a faint smile touching his mouth. "I think I understand now what you meant," Grace said. "Most people would have looked at a woman sleeping on a stone bench and seen only trouble, only inconvenience. You saw someone worth a second look. I do not think I will ever be able to properly thank you for that." "You do not need to thank me," Dante said. "You have already given me more than you realize. Before you, Grace, I do not think I understood what it meant to want to come home to somewhere, rather than simply return to a house because duty required it. This garden was my grandmother's favorite place in the world. I used to think I kept it because I could not bear to sell the land. Now I think some part of me was always waiting for someone who belonged here as much as she once did." Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion she did not try to hide. "She would have liked you," she said softly. "Not the version of you that walks into rooms and makes grown men go quiet. The version who sat beside me in the dark and asked questions instead of giving orders." "I would like to believe that," Dante said. "I think perhaps she would have liked you a great deal more. She always did have a soft spot for anyone with more stubbornness than sense." Grace laughed, a real, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise them both with its lightness, given everything they had survived together to reach this quiet evening. It was a sound she had not made freely in a very long time, not since the days before Edmund Price and everything that followed, and hearing it now, in this restored garden, felt like reclaiming some small, precious piece of the woman she used to be. Margaret found them there as the last of the light faded from the sky, carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea, setting it down on the small stone table near the bench without a word, though the satisfied look on her face said everything she did not bother to voice aloud. She had seen this house through years of quiet and years of danger, through Dante's grandmother's final days, and through the long, empty silence that followed. Watching it slowly fill again with warmth and laughter seemed, to her, worth every difficult year that had come before. "The kitchen is finally starting to smell like something other than dust," Margaret said, settling into a nearby chair with the easy familiarity of someone who had long since stopped waiting for an invitation. "I made the mistake of telling one of the men about your bread, Grace. Now half the estate is asking when you intend to open properly." "Tell them soon," Grace said, smiling. "I have missed the sound of an oven working through the night." "You will have that again," Dante said, his voice carrying quiet certainty. "Whatever you want to rebuild here, Grace, you will have the chance to build it. This house has stood empty long enough. It is time it served a purpose again." As the evening deepened into night, the 3 of them remained in the garden a while longer, the conversation drifting easily between memories and small plans for the future, the kind of ordinary, unremarkable comfort that Grace had once feared she would never know again. She thought of the frightened, exhausted woman who had first stumbled through a broken gate, seeking nothing more than a safe place to close her eyes, and marveled at how far that woman had traveled since, not simply in circumstance, but in the quiet, steady strength she had rediscovered along the way. Whatever dangers this world might still hold, whatever challenges awaited them in the future, she understood now that she had found something worth facing them for. The garden, once abandoned and forgotten, had become the beginning of everything, and Grace, once lost and unseen, had finally found a place and a person worth calling home.